Little girl calls wrong emergency number when her mother faints. Few minutes later, a Mafia boss did this. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's diner buzzed like angry wasps as Grace Martinez wiped down the last table of her double shift. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold Chicago wind rattling the windows, but from exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones. 16 hours on her feet, serving coffee and scrambled eggs to truckers and late-night wanderers, all for tips that barely covered Sophie's school supplies. "You heading out, honey?" called Betty, the night manager, her voice thick with cigarettes and concern. "You look like death warmed over." Grace forced a smile. "Just tired. Sophie's probably worried sick. I promised her mac and cheese for dinner." "That was 12 hours ago, Grace. Go home to your baby." The November air hit Grace like a slap as she stepped outside. Her beat-up Honda Civic coughed to life on the third try, and she whispered a prayer that it would make it the 8 blocks to their apartment. The radio crackled with some late-night talk show, but Grace barely heard it over the rumbling of her empty stomach. When was the last time she'd eaten? Yesterday morning? The day before? Their apartment building stood crooked against the Chicago skyline like a broken tooth. Grace climbed the 3 flights of stairs slowly, each step feeling like she was walking through quicksand. The hallway smelled of old cooking grease and broken dreams. "Mommy!" Sophie's voice rang out the moment Grace's key turned in the lock. Her 7-year-old daughter flew into her arms, all wild curls and gap-toothed grin. "You're home! I saved you some cereal from breakfast." Grace's heart clenched. Sophie had been eating cereal for breakfast, lunch, and probably dinner. Again. "That's okay, baby. Mommy's just—" The world tilted sideways. Grace grabbed the doorframe, but her knees buckled anyway. The last thing she saw was Sophie's face, those big brown eyes filling with terror. "Mommy? Mommy!" Sophie shook her mother's shoulder, but Grace lay still on the thin carpet, her face pale as chalk. Panic shot through the little girl like electricity. She'd seen this on TV. When grown-ups fell down and wouldn't wake up, you called for help. Sophie grabbed her mom's old flip phone from the coffee table, her small fingers shaking. She knew the number, 911. But in her terror, fumbling with the unfamiliar buttons, she pressed wrong. Instead of 911, she dialed 941. The phone rang once, twice. 15 miles away, in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Vincenzo Marino sat behind his mahogany desk reviewing shipping manifests that had nothing to do with legal cargo. At 52, he commanded respect through whispered threats and calculated violence. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his Italian suit worth more than most people's cars. The Marino family had controlled Chicago's South Side for 3 generations, and Vincenzo had earned his place at the top through methods that kept prosecutors awake at night. His private phone, the number known only to his inner circle, rang with an unfamiliar tone. Vincenzo frowned. No one called this line without clearance. "Who is this?" His voice carried the weight of barely contained menace. Please help me." The voice was small, broken, definitely a child. "My mommy won't wake up." Vincenzo's frown deepened. "A prank call? Some rival family's sick joke?" "Listen, kid, I don't know how you got this number, but she's on the floor and she's not moving and I don't know what to do." The sobs came through the phone like bullets to Vincenzo's chest. "Please, mister, I don't have anybody else. Please help my mommy." The phone went silent except for the sound of a 7-year-old girl crying. Vincenzo's hand tightened around the phone. The voice, the desperation, the pure terror, it crashed over him like a wave. Suddenly he wasn't in his penthouse anymore. He was in a different room, 7 years ago, holding another phone, listening to another child cry. His child. His Isabella. "Where are you?" The words came out rougher than he intended. I don't know." "Wait," he heard shuffling. 327 Oak Street. Apartment 3B. "Please hurry, mister. I'm scared." 327 Oak Street. That was deep in rival territory, a neighborhood where Vincenzo Marino's name was whispered with fear and hatred. A place where a man like him had no business going, especially not for a random phone call from a crying child. But something in that little girl's voice had cracked something inside him that he thought was sealed shut forever. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophie. Sophie Martinez." "My mommy's name is Grace." "Okay, Sophie. I'm coming to help you, but I need you to stay calm, alright? Stay with your mommy. Don't open the door for anyone except me. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Are you a policeman?" Vincenzo closed his eyes. "Something like that. I'll be there soon." He hung up and pressed the intercom button. "Marco. Tony. My office. Now." Two men appeared instantly. Marco, his right hand built like a brick wall with eyes that missed nothing, and Tony, younger but equally dangerous, with reflexes like a snake. "Boss?" Marco's gravelly voice carried a question. "We're taking a drive. 327 Oak Street. Boss, that's... I know where it is." Vincenzo stood, straightening his tie. "And I know whose territory it is. We go anyway." Tony exchanged a look with Marco. "How many men you want?" "Just us three." "And Tony?" Vincenzo moved toward the door. "Bring the medical kit from the safe. We might need it." As they headed for the elevator, Marco couldn't help himself. "Boss, what's this about?" Vincenzo thought about Sophie's voice, about the way she'd said, "Please," like it was the only word left in the world that mattered. He thought about Isabella, and how she'd sounded exactly the same way during that last phone call 7 years ago. "Someone needs help," he said simply. "And sometimes that's enough." The elevator doors closed, carrying Chicago's most feared man toward a destiny he never could have imagined, all because a scared little girl had dialed the wrong number. The black Escalade tore through Chicago's streets like a shadow cutting through light. Vincenzo sat in the passenger seat, his jaw clenched tight, while Marco navigated the maze of narrow streets leading into territory that belonged to the Castellano family. This was enemy ground, a place where the wrong move could start a war. "Boss, you sure about this?" Tony asked from the back seat, his hand resting on the gun beneath his jacket. "Castellano's boys patrol this area heavy. They see us here. They won't see us," Vincenzo said, his voice steady as steel. "We get in, handle the situation, get out. Clean and quiet." But even as he spoke, his mind wasn't on territorial disputes or family politics. It was on a little girl named Sophie, alone and scared, waiting for a stranger to save her mother. The image reminded him too much of Isabella's last night, how she'd called him from the hospital, her voice weak and frightened, begging him to come home. By the time he'd fought through rival territory to reach her, it was too late. Not this time. This time, he'd be fast enough. The Escalade pulled up to 327 Oak Street, and Vincenzo's experienced eyes immediately catalogued every detail. Broken streetlights casting uneven shadows. Fire escapes that could hide snipers. Alleyways perfect for ambushes. The building itself looked like it was held together by stubbornness and prayer. Cracked brick walls, rusted railings, windows patched with duct tape. "Third floor, apartment 3B, Vincenzo said, stepping out of the car. "Marco, watch the street. Tony, with me." They climbed the stairs two at a time, their expensive shoes echoing in the narrow stairwell. The building smelled like despair and broken promises, a far cry from the world Vincenzo usually inhabited. When they reached the third floor, he could hear it, soft crying coming from behind a door marked 3B. Vincenzo knocked gently, 3 soft taps. "Sophie? It's the man you called. I'm here to help your mommy." The crying stopped. After a moment, a small voice called out, "How do I know it's really you?" Smart girl, Vincenzo thought. Even at 7, she had survival instincts. "You told me your name was Sophie Martinez, and your mommy's name is Grace. You live in apartment 3B on Oak Street. And you're very brave for taking care of your mommy." The sound of a chain being unlatched reached them through the door. It opened slowly, revealing the smallest girl Vincenzo had ever seen. She had wild curls that seemed to have a life of their own, brown eyes swimming with tears, and she was wearing a purple dress that had seen better days. But it was the way she looked at him, with desperate hope and absolute trust, that hit him like a punch to the chest. "Are you really here to help?" Sophie whispered. Vincenzo knelt down to her level, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm really here. Can you show me where your mommy is?" Sophie led them into the tiny apartment, and Vincenzo's trained eyes took in everything: the sparse furniture, the empty refrigerator visible through the open kitchen door, the bills scattered on a wobbly table. This wasn't just poverty, this was desperation. Grace lay unconscious on the living room floor, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Vincenzo knelt beside her, checking her pulse with surprising gentleness. "When did she fall down?" he asked Sophie. "Right when she came home. She was really tired. She works at the diner, and sometimes she doesn't eat because she wants me to have her food." Sophie's voice grew smaller. "Is she going to be okay?" Vincenzo's jaw tightened. This woman had been starving herself to feed her daughter. "She's going to be fine, Sophie. But we need to get her to a doctor. Tony, bring the car closer to the building." As Tony disappeared, Vincenzo carefully lifted Grace into his arms. She was lighter than she should be, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. Her eyes fluttered open as he carried her toward the door. "What? Who are you?" Grace's voice was weak, confused. "Sophie, where's Sophie?" "Right here, Mommy!" Sophie grabbed onto Vincenzo's coat. "This is the nice man who came to help us." Grace tried to focus on Vincenzo's face, but the world kept spinning. All she could see was a stranger, a big, intimidating stranger in an expensive suit, carrying her like she weighed nothing. Fear cut through her exhaustion. "Put me down," she whispered. "I don't know you." "Sophie, stay away from him." "Mommy, no! He's helping us." Sophie's small hand found Vincenzo's, and she squeezed tight. "He came when I called for help. He's good." Vincenzo met Grace's frightened eyes. "Ma'am, you collapsed from exhaustion and hunger. Your daughter called for help, and I'm taking you to a doctor. That's all." "I can't afford a doctor," Grace mumbled, fighting to stay conscious. "You don't need to worry about that." Vincenzo's voice was firm but not unkind. "Just worry about getting better." The ride to Dr. Chen's private clinic passed in a blur for Grace. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of Sophie's small hand in hers and the steady presence of the stranger who'd somehow appeared in their moment of greatest need. Dr. Chen, a small Korean-American woman who'd been patching up Vincenzo's men for 15 years without asking questions, worked quickly and efficiently. For fluids, vitamins, a thorough examination. "Severe dehydration and malnutrition," she reported quietly to Vincenzo while Grace dozed. "She probably hasn't eaten a proper meal in days. Maybe weeks." Vincenzo handed her an envelope thick with cash. "Fix her up. Whatever she needs." "And the little girl?" Vincenzo looked through the window at Sophie, who sat in the waiting room, her legs swinging from a chair too big for her. She was humming quietly to herself, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. "Check her too. Make sure she's healthy." When Sophie saw Vincenzo approaching, her face lit up like Christmas morning. "Is Mommy going to be okay?" "She's going to be just fine." Vincenzo sat down beside her, this little girl who trusted him completely despite not knowing his name. "The doctor is giving her medicine to make her strong again." Sophie suddenly threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tight. "Thank you for saving my mommy, mister. You're the nicest man in the whole world." For a moment, Vincenzo couldn't breathe. It had been 7 years since anyone had hugged him like that, with pure love and gratitude. 7 years since Isabella had wrapped her arms around his neck and called him the best daddy ever. "What's your name?" Sophie asked, pulling back to look at him with those trusting brown eyes. Vincenzo hesitated. "How do you tell a 7-year-old that you're the man parents in this neighborhood use to scare their children into behaving?" "My name is Vincent," he said finally. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. "Thank you, Mr. Vincent. You're my hero." And in that moment, As this brave little girl smiled at him like he'd hung the stars, Vincenzo Marino, a man who commanded an empire built on fear, felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he could be someone's hero after all. Grace woke up in a hospital bed that was far too comfortable for someone without insurance. Sunlight streamed through windows that actually had clean glass, and the sheets beneath her hands felt like silk compared to the rough blankets in her apartment. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel grateful, then reality crashed back in. Sophie was gone. Grace sat up too quickly, her head spinning from the sudden movement. "Sophie! Where's my daughter?" "Right here, Mommy!" Sophie bounced through the doorway, carrying a paper cup of hot chocolate, and wearing a smile that could power half of Chicago. "Mr. Vincent got me chocolate! And look!" She held up a small teddy bear. "The nice lady at the desk gave me this. His name is Coco." Behind Sophie, a figure filled the doorway, the man from last night. In the harsh light of day, Grace could see him clearly for the first time. Tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair silver at the temples. His suit probably cost more than she made in 6 months, and his eyes. His eyes were the color of steel, but when they looked at Sophie, they softened in a way that confused Grace completely. "How are you feeling?" Vincent asked, his voice carrying a concern that seemed genuine. "Better, thank you." Grace's words were careful, polite. "I appreciate what you did, but we should probably get going. I have to work tonight, and Sophie has school." "Mommy, you can't work. The doctor said you need to rest for 3 days," Sophie protested. "And Mr. Vincent said he'd take us for pancakes." Grace's eyes snapped to Vincent's. "That's very kind, but we can't accept." Mrs. Martinez, a small Asian woman in a white coat, entered the room. "I'm Dr. Chen. How are you feeling?" "Much better." "When can we leave?" Dr. Chen consulted her chart. "Your blood work shows severe nutritional deficiencies. I'd like to keep you for observation another day, and you'll need to follow a specific diet plan. I can't afford another day here." Grace's voice was steady, but Vincent caught the underlying panic. "Please, just discharge me now. The bill has been taken care of," Dr. Chen said gently. "Mr. Marino has covered everything, including your prescriptions and follow-up care." The room went deadly quiet. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "What did you just call him?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Dr. Chen glanced between Grace and Vincent. "No, Vincenzo," with growing concern. "Mr. Marino." "Vincenzo Marino." Grace's world tilted sideways for the second time in 24 hours, but this time it wasn't from hunger. Vincenzo Marino. She knew that name. Everyone in Chicago knew that name. The newspapers called him the Ghost of the South Side, the man who controlled everything from the docks to the gambling dens. The reason mothers locked their doors early and fathers spoke in whispers about protection money. And she'd let him carry her daughter. "Get out," the words came out like broken glass. Sophie looked confused. "Mommy? Get out of this room." Now Grace's voice rose with each word. "Sophie, come here. Right now." "Ma'am," Vincenzo started, but Grace cut him off. "Don't you dare ma'am me! I know who you are!" She struggled to stand, yanking the floor from her arm despite Dr. Chen's protests. "You're Vincenzo Marino. You're the head of the crime family that's been bleeding this city dry for 30 years. Sophie pressed herself against the wall, her new teddy bear clutched tight. "Mommy, you're scaring me." "Sophie, come here." Grace held out her hand, but Sophie didn't move. Away from him. "But Mommy, he helped us. He's nice." "He's not nice, baby. He's dangerous." Grace's voice cracked. "He hurts people for money. He's the reason Mrs. Castellano down the hall cries every night because she can't afford her rent after paying his protection money." Vincenzo's face remained calm, but his eyes hardened slightly. "Mrs. Martinez, I understand your concern." "Do you?" Grace laughed bitterly. "Do you really? Because I've spent 7 years keeping my daughter away from men like you. Away from the violence and the fear and the—" She stopped, looking at Sophie's tears. Why did you help us? What do you want? Nothing. Liar. Grace moved towards Sophie, but her daughter stepped closer to Vincenzo instead. Men like you don't do anything without wanting something back. So what is it? Money? A favor? Information? Vincenzo was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than Grace expected. Your daughter called me. She was scared. She needed help. That's all. That's all? Grace's voice pitched higher. You expect me to believe that the most dangerous man in Chicago just happened to answer a wrong number and decided to play Good Samaritan? Sometimes things are exactly what they appear to be. Not in your world, they're not. Grace finally reached Sophie and grabbed her hand. Come on, baby. We're leaving. No! Sophie pulled away, surprising them both. I don't want to leave Mr. Vincent. He saved you, Mommy. Why are you being mean to him? Grace knelt down, her heart breaking at the confusion in her daughter's eyes. Sophie, sweetie, he's not a good man. He is too. Sophie's voice rose to match her mother's. He carried you when you were sick. He got you medicine. He bought me chocolate. Good people do those things. Sophie. I want to see him again. Sophie crossed her arms, her little chin set in a stubborn line that reminded Grace painfully of herself. He's my friend. Grace looked up at Vincenzo, who stood perfectly still, letting the argument play out. There was something in his expression, a sadness that seemed bone deep, that made her pause. Why? She asked quietly. Why did you really come? Vincenzo looked at Sophie, then back at Grace. For just a moment, his carefully controlled mask slipped, and Grace saw something unexpected: grief. Because 7 years ago, my daughter called me for help, he said simply. And I didn't make it in time. The room fell silent except for the sound of Sophie sniffling. She was 6, Vincenzo continued. Car accident. She died calling for her daddy. He paused. When Sophie called last night, when I heard her voice, I couldn't let history repeat itself. Grace felt her anger waver, but she forced it back. She couldn't afford to be soft. Not with Sophie's safety at stake. I'm sorry for your loss, she said stiffly. But that doesn't change who you are. Or what you do. No, Vincenzo agreed. It doesn't. Then you understand why we have to leave. Why Sophie can't see you again. Sophie's face crumpled. But Mommy. No buts, baby. Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices. Grace stood, pulling Sophie toward the door. Thank you for your help, Mr. Marino. But this ends here. She was almost to the door when Vincenzo spoke again. The men who control your neighborhood, the ones who make Mrs. Castellano cry, they're not mine. Grace stopped but didn't turn around. They work for Matteo Castellano. He's been moving into my territory, using fear tactics I don't approve of. Vincenzo's voice was quiet but clear. If you ever need help dealing with them, you know how to reach me. Grace finally turned, her eyes blazing. I will never call you again. I know, Vincenzo said. But Sophie knows the number. And children sometimes make their own choices. As Grace led her daughter out of the room, she missed the way Sophie looked back at Vincenzo, her small hand waving goodbye. She also missed the way he nodded back, a silent promise passing between them. Outside the hospital, as they waited for a taxi, Sophie looked up at her mother with serious 7-year-old eyes. Mommy, why can't bad people do good things sometimes? Grace didn't have an answer for that. But as their taxi pulled away from the curb, she couldn't shake the feeling that she just walked away from something important. Something that might have changed all their lives. 3 days after the hospital incident, Grace found a bag of groceries outside their apartment door. Fresh milk, bread that wasn't stale, actual fruits and vegetables, and tucked inside, a note written in careful block letters. From a friend. For Sophie. Grace's first instinct was to throw it all away. She knew exactly which friend had left it. But Sophie was watching, and the cupboards were bare, and pride didn't fill empty stomachs. Can we keep it, Mommy? Sophie asked, her eyes wide with hope. Look, there's the cereal with the marshmallows. Grace sighed, carrying the bag inside. Just this once. But it wasn't just once. Every few days, something appeared, sometimes groceries, sometimes a book for Sophie, once a bottle of children's vitamins with a note that said, Dr. Chen recommends these. Always the same message. From a friend. Grace told herself she was only accepting it for Sophie's sake. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself a lot of things that became harder to believe with each passing day. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening. Grace returned from her shift to find their building's superintendent, Mr. Kowalski, waiting in the lobby with a concerned expression and a manila envelope. Grace, honey, somebody paid your rent for the next 3 months, he said, scratching his gray head. Left cash in my mailbox. Said to give you this. Inside the envelope was a receipt and another note. No child should worry about having a roof over her head. From a friend. This time, Grace didn't hesitate. She grabbed Sophie's hand and marched straight to the phone booth on the corner, dialing the number she'd memorized despite herself. You have to stop, she said the moment Vincenzo answered. Mrs. Martinez. His voice was calm, unsurprised. How can I help you? You know how. Stop sending things. Stop paying our bills. We don't need your charity. It's not charity. It's from a friend. Yes, I got the notes. Grace lowered her voice, conscious of Sophie tugging at her coat. Look, I appreciate what you did at the hospital, but this has to end. I won't be indebted to you. You're not indebted to anyone. A friend helps when they can, that's all. We're not friends, Mr. Marino. We can't be friends. There was a pause. Then I won't bother you anymore. Grace hung up, feeling simultaneously relieved and strangely empty. She'd done the right thing. She'd protected Sophie from getting too attached to a dangerous man. So why did she feel like she just made a terrible mistake? 2 weeks of silence passed. No groceries, no gifts, no mysterious bill payments. Grace told herself this was what she wanted, even as she watched Sophie grow quieter, spending long minutes staring out their window like she was waiting for someone who would never come. Then Sophie got sick. It started with a cough and quickly developed into a fever that had Grace pacing their tiny apartment at 3 a.m. She couldn't afford another doctor visit, not after missing work to care for Sophie. But watching her daughter shiver despite 3 blankets, Grace felt panic rising in her throat. The knock on their door came at 3:17 a.m. Grace peered through the peephole and saw a figure in an expensive coat holding a small bag. I know you don't want to see me, Vincenzo said when she opened the door. But Tony's kid had the same thing last week. This medicine will help. He held out the bag, children's fever reducer, cough syrup, and throat lozenges. All the things Grace couldn't afford. How did you know she was sick? Grace asked quietly. Mrs. Patterson next door mentioned it to her nephew, who works at one of my restaurants. Vincenzo's explanation was matter-of-fact. I thought you might need help. Grace wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door and handle this alone. But then Sophie coughed from the bedroom, a sound that tore at Grace's heart. Thank you, she whispered, taking the bag. I'll pay you back when. Mrs. Martinez. Vincenzo's voice was gentle. Not everything has to be a transaction. As he turned to leave, Sophie appeared in the hallway, wrapped in her favorite blanket and looking like a small ghost. Mr. Vincent? Her voice was hoarse but hopeful. Vincenzo stopped, his expression softening completely. Hey there, sweetheart. I heard you weren't feeling well. I miss you, Sophie said simply. Mommy said you weren't coming back. Grace watched, her heart clenching, as Vincenzo knelt down to Sophie's level despite his expensive suit. I'm sorry about that, he said. Your mommy was trying to protect you. That's what good mommies do. But you're good too. You brought me medicine when I was sick. Only good people do that. Sophie, you should get back to bed. Grace interrupted, but her voice lacked conviction. Can Mr. Vincent read me a story? Please? Just until I fall asleep? Grace looked at Vincenzo, This man who terrified an entire city but was asking her 7-year-old's permission with his eyes. She saw something in his face, a careful hope, like he was afraid to want something too much. "One story," Grace heard herself say. "Then he has to go." Sophie beamed and took Vincenzo's hand, leading him to her room. Grace followed, settling into the chair by Sophie's bed while Vincenzo sat on the floor, looking ridiculously out of place in his tailored suit surrounded by stuffed animals and children's books. "What would you like me to read?" he asked. "The one about the princess who saves herself," Sophie said, handing him a worn copy of The Paper Bag Princess. As Vincenzo read, Grace found herself studying him, really looking at him for the first time. His voice was different when he spoke to Sophie, softer, with a patience that seemed infinite. When Sophie interrupted to ask questions or make observations, he answered each one seriously, like her 7-year-old thoughts were the most important things in the world. This wasn't the man the newspapers wrote about. This wasn't the monster parents used to frighten their children into good behavior. This was just a man who'd lost his daughter and found a little girl who needed him. Across town, in a warehouse that reeked of cigarettes and desperation, Matteo Castellano poured himself another whiskey and studied the photographs scattered across his desk. Grace leaving work, Sophie walking to school, both of them accepting packages from unknown delivery men. "You're sure it's Marino's money paying their bills?" he asked his lieutenant, a thin man with nervous eyes named Eddie. "Positive, boss. Got confirmation from 3 different sources. The woman and kid, they're under his protection now." Matteo smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Vincenzo Marino, the great untouchable, has found himself a weakness." He picked up a photo of Sophie laughing in the playground. "How interesting. What do you want us to do?" Matteo leaned back in his chair, already planning. Vincenzo had been impossible to touch for years. Too smart, too careful, too well protected. But everyone had a breaking point. Even ghosts could bleed if you knew where to cut. "Keep watching them," he said finally. "And when the time is right, we're going to send Mr. Marino a message he'll never forget." In the photo, Sophie Martinez smiled up at the camera, unaware that she'd just become the most dangerous weapon in Chicago's criminal underworld. Grace first noticed the gray sedan on a Tuesday morning while walking Sophie to school. It was parked across from their building, engine running, windows tinted too dark to see inside. When she looked back after dropping Sophie off, it was gone. Wednesday, it was a different car, a black SUV this time, but parked in the same spot. The same feeling of being watched crawled up her spine like ice water. By Thursday, Grace had convinced herself she was being paranoid. She worked at a diner in a rough neighborhood, dealt with drunk truckers and men who thought a waitress was included with their coffee. Maybe one of them had followed her home. Maybe it was nothing. But Friday morning, when she saw the same thin man in a baseball cap lingering near the school entrance for the 3rd day in a row, Grace's maternal instincts kicked into high gear. "Sophie, stay close to me," she whispered, pulling her daughter's hand tighter as they walked past the stranger. The man turned away, suddenly very interested in his phone, but Grace caught his reflection in a storefront window. He was watching them. Definitely watching them. That night at Murphy's diner, Grace's hands shook as she poured coffee. Her manager, Betty, noticed immediately. "Honey, you look like you've seen a ghost. What's eating you?" Grace glanced around the nearly empty diner before leaning closer. "I think someone's been following me." "Following Sophie too." Betty's expression darkened. "You call the police? And tell them what? That I've seen some cars parked on public streets?" Grace shook her head. "They'd laugh me out of the station. Maybe it's one of your customers. Some creep who—" "No," Grace's voice was firm. "This feels different. Professional." What she didn't say, what she couldn't say, was that deep down, she suspected this had something to do with Vincenzo Marino. Ever since that night he'd read to Sophie, ever since she'd seen that gentle side of him, Grace had been wondering if accepting his help had painted a target on their backs. Across town, Marco Benedetti sat across from Vincenzo in the private dining room of Riccardo's, an Italian restaurant that served as an unofficial meeting place for the Marino family's business discussions. The lunch crowd provided perfect cover for sensitive conversations. "We got a problem, boss," Marcos said quietly, cutting into his veal. "Matteo Castellano's been asking questions about you. Specifically about your new interests." Vincenzo's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that involve surveillance photos of a certain woman and her kid." Marco's voice dropped even lower. "Word is, Matteo's been having the Martinez family watched for 2 weeks now. He knows about the groceries, the rent payments, everything." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Vincenzo set down his fork with deliberate care. "How close have they gotten?" "Close enough to know the kid's schedule. Close enough to know when the mother works late shifts." Marco's scarred face was grim. "Boss, I think Matteo's planning something." Vincenzo's jaw clenched. He'd been careful, or so he thought. Anonymous deliveries, cash payments, no direct contact except for that one night when Sophie was sick. But apparently it hadn't been careful enough. "Double the security around them," he ordered. "I want eyes on Grace and Sophie 24/7. "Boss," Marco hesitated. "Maybe it's time to bring them in. Move them somewhere safe until we deal with Matteo." Vincenzo considered this, then shook his head. "Grace would never agree to that. She'd run first, take Sophie somewhere I can't protect them. Then what? Then we watch. We wait. And if Matteo makes a move..." Vincenzo's eyes turned cold. "We remind him why people fear the name Marino." That evening, Grace was walking home from her late shift when she finally worked up the courage to make the call. She ducked into the same phone booth she'd used before, Sophie safely at home with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chin. "It's Grace Martinez," she said when Vincenzo answered. "We need to talk." 20 minutes later, she found herself sitting across from him in his car, a sleek black sedan that probably cost more than she'd make in 5 years. Vincenzo had come alone, which surprised her. "You're being watched," he said without preamble. Grace's blood turned to ice. "I knew it. I've been seeing the same cars, the same faces." She turned to face him fully. "This is because of you, isn't it?" Vincenzo didn't deny it. "A rival is trying to use you to get to me. He sees you and Sophie as leverage." "Leverage," Grace's voice was hollow. "My daughter is leverage in some gang war she has nothing to do with. She has something to do with it because she means something to me," Vincenzo said quietly. "And that makes her valuable to my enemies." Grace closed her eyes, fighting back tears of rage and fear. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. This is why I didn't want you in our lives. I know. But you kept pushing. Kept sending gifts and paying bills and..." She stopped, looking at him with sudden understanding. "You knew this would happen, didn't you? You knew getting involved with US would put us in danger." Vincenzo was quiet for a long moment. "I hoped it wouldn't. But yes, I knew it was possible. And you did it anyway." Grace's voice rose. "You put my daughter at risk for what? Some misplaced guilt about your own child?" The words hit Vincenzo like physical blows, but he took them without flinching. "Yes." His honesty deflated Grace's anger, leaving only fear behind. "What do they want?" "To hurt me. And hurting you would accomplish that." Grace felt panic rising in her throat. "We have to leave. Tonight. I'll pack what we can carry, Anne. Running won't work. Matteo has resources, connections. He'd find you. Then what do you suggest? Let me move you somewhere safe. Both of you. Until I can handle this situation." Grace laughed bitterly. "Handle it? You mean kill people?" "I mean protect my family." The words hung in the air between them. Grace stared at him, this man who'd just called her and Sophie his family with such casual certainty. "We're not your family," she whispered. "Sophie thinks we are. And what Sophie thinks matters to me. She's 7 years old. She doesn't understand what you do, what you are. She understands that I care about her. That I'd die before I let anyone hurt her." Vincenzo's voice was steady, absolute. Can you say the same about anyone else in your life? Grace wanted to argue, but the truth was brutal and simple. She couldn't. There was no one else. No family, no support system, no white knight coming to rescue them. Just her, alone, against forces she couldn't understand or fight. But that didn't mean she'd surrender. I won't let Sophie grow up in your world, she said firmly. I won't let her think this is normal. The violence, the fear, the constant looking over your shoulder. Ben, trust me to keep that world away from her. By bringing more violence into our lives? By ending the threat. Permanently. Grace shuddered at the cold certainty in his voice. And what happens to us after? When the next rival decides to use us against you? And the next one after that? Vincenzo didn't have an answer for that, and his silence was answer enough. I can't, Grace said finally. I can't accept your protection, because accepting it means accepting everything that comes with it. The danger, the blood, the endless cycle of violence. She opened the car door. Find another way to handle this. One that doesn't involve us. As she walked away, Vincenzo watched her go with a mixture of admiration and despair. Grace Martinez was the strongest person he'd ever met, and also the most stubborn. But as he sat alone in his car, thinking about Sophie's trusting smile and Grace's fierce protectiveness, Vincenzo made a silent vow. Whether Grace accepted his protection or not, whether she trusted him or not, whether she ever spoke to him again or not, he would keep them safe. Even if it meant going to war. Even if it cost him everything. Some things were worth any price. Grace should have known better than to bring Sophie to work on a Friday night. But Mrs. Chen had fallen ill and there was no one else to watch her daughter. Sophie sat quietly in the back booth of Murphy's diner, coloring in a worn activity book while Grace served the late-night crowd of truckers and insomniacs. Mommy, can we go home now? Sophie asked for the third time in an hour. I'm sleepy. Grace glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. Her shift didn't end until midnight, but the diner was nearly empty, and Betty was already counting the till. Go ahead, honey, Betty called out. I can finish up here. Get that baby home to bed. Grace untied her apron with relief. Come on, sweetheart. Let's go home. The November air bit at their faces as they stepped onto the deserted street. Grace pulled Sophie's jacket tighter and quickened their pace. The walk to the bus stop was only 3 blocks, but something felt wrong. The streetlights cast eerie shadows, and the usual sounds of the city seemed muffled, distant. Mommy, I forgot Mr. Bear, Sophie said suddenly, stopping in her tracks. Grace sighed. The stuffed animal Vincenzo had brought during Sophie's illness had become her daughter's constant companion. Honey, we can't go back now. Mr. Bear will be safe at the diner until tomorrow, but he gets scared without me, Sophie protested, her 7-year-old logic unshakable. Sophie, please. We need to get to the bus. The first man stepped out of the alley so smoothly it seemed choreographed. Tall, lean, wearing a black jacket that couldn't hide the bulge of a weapon beneath. Grace's blood froze. Mrs. Martinez? The man said, his voice carrying a slight Italian accent. Mr. Castellano would like to have a word with you. Grace instinctively moved in front of Sophie, her mind racing. The bus stop was still 2 blocks away. The diner was behind them, but Betty would have locked up by now. The street was empty except for a few parked cars. They were alone. I don't know any Mr. Castellano, Grace said, proud that her voice didn't shake. And we need to get home. A second man emerged from behind a parked van. Shorter, stockier, with cold eyes that lingered on Sophie in a way that made Grace's skin crawl. I'm afraid that's not an option, the first man said. See, you've become quite important to our business interests. You and your daughter. Run, Sophie, Grace whispered. But Mommy! Run! Sophie bolted, her small legs carrying her back toward the diner as fast as they could. The stocky man lunged after her, but Grace threw herself at him, clawing and kicking with desperate fury. Let her go! She screamed. She's just a child. The tall man grabbed Grace's arms, yanking them behind her back with professional efficiency. Should have thought about that before you started playing house with Vincenzo Marino. 50 feet away, the stocky man had caught up to Sophie, lifting her off the ground as she kicked and screamed. Mommy! Mommy! Grace's world narrowed to that sound, her daughter's terrified cries cutting through the night like broken glass. She bit down hard on the tall man's hand, tasting blood, and broke free just long enough to scream. Help! Somebody help us! The blow came from behind, sending stars exploding across Grace's vision. She hit the pavement hard, her hands scraping against asphalt, but even through the haze of pain, she could hear Sophie crying. Please! Grace gasped, trying to push herself up. Please don't hurt her. Take me, do whatever you want, but don't hurt my daughter. The tall man hauled her to her feet. Oh, we're not going to hurt her. She's our insurance policy. As long as Marino cares about you both, he'll do exactly what we tell him to. That's when the black Escalade came screaming around the corner. It didn't slow down. It didn't hesitate. It aimed straight for the stocky man holding Sophie and slammed on the brakes at the last possible second, close enough that the man had to dive sideways to avoid being crushed. Sophie tumbled to the ground, sobbing but unharmed. Car doors slammed open simultaneously. Marco and Tony emerged from the Escalade like predators released from cages, weapons already drawn. But it was Vincenzo who stepped out of the passenger seat that made the attackers freeze. Gone was any pretense of civilization. This wasn't the man who read bedtime stories and brought medicine for sick children. This was the ghost of the South Side, and his eyes promised death. You made a mistake, Vincenzo said, his voice carrying across the empty street with deadly calm. You touched my family. The tall man still holding Grace tried to use her as a human shield, pressing a knife to her throat. Stay back, Marino! One more step and Vincenzo's gun appeared in his hand so fast it seemed like magic. The shot echoed off the buildings like thunder. The tall man dropped instantly, the knife clattering harmlessly away. The stocky man rolled to his feet and ran. He made it exactly 6 steps before Tony brought him down with a tackle that would have made the Chicago Bears proud. The sound of breaking bones carried clearly in the cold night air. Marco was already on his radio, calling for cleanup. Within minutes the street would be clear, the evidence gone, as if nothing had ever happened. But for now, there was only Sophie sobbing and Grace's ragged breathing. Vincenzo holstered his weapon and knelt beside Sophie, who threw herself into his arms without hesitation. It's okay, sweetheart, he murmured, stroking her hair while she cried against his chest. You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you. Grace crawled over to them on shaking hands, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The violence had been swift, brutal, and absolutely necessary. Without Vincenzo's intervention, she and Sophie would have disappeared into the night, becoming pawns in a game they didn't understand. How did you know? She whispered. Vincenzo met her eyes over Sophie's head. I've had men watching you for weeks. When the attack started, they called it in. You've been watching us. It should have made her angry, but all Grace felt was overwhelming gratitude. I told you I'd protect you, Vincenzo said simply. Whether you wanted it or not. Sophie pulled back to look at his face, her small hands touching his cheeks with devastating trust. You came for us. You saved us. Always, Vincenzo promised. I will always come for you. Grace looked around at the aftermath, the blood on the pavement, the broken man being loaded into the back of a van, the cold efficiency with which Vincenzo's men were erasing all evidence of what had happened here. This was his world. This was what loving him meant. And as terrifying as it was, as much as it went against everything she tried to shield Sophie from, Grace finally understood the truth. They were already part of this world whether she accepted it or not. The only question now was whether they'd survive it. Vincenzo's mansion sat on the shores of Lake Michigan like a fortress made of glass and stone. As their car pulled through the iron gates, Grace pressed her face to the window, trying to process the reality of where they were going. The circular driveway was longer than her entire block, lined with perfectly manicured hedges that probably cost more to maintain than she made in a year. Sophie had fallen asleep during the 20-minute drive, exhaustion finally claiming her after the night's terror. She lay curled against Grace's side, one small hand still clutching Vincenzo's jacket sleeve, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. "She's safe here," Vincenzo said quietly, following Grace's gaze to the security cameras and armed guards stationed discreetly around the property. "Safer than anywhere else in the city." Grace nodded but didn't speak. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that man's hands on Sophie, heard her daughter's screams echoing in the night. The violence that had followed, swift, brutal, necessary, played on repeat in her mind. Inside the mansion, Grace felt like she'd stepped into a different world. Marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers, and paintings that belonged in museums hung on walls that stretched up to impossible heights. It was beautiful and intimidating and nothing like the cramped apartment where she and Sophie had built their small life. "The guest wing is upstairs," Vincenzo said, carrying the still sleeping Sophie with gentle care. "She can rest there." He led them up a grand staircase to a bedroom that was bigger than Grace's entire apartment. The bed could have slept 6 people comfortably, and French doors opened onto a balcony overlooking the lake. Vincenzo laid Sophie down on the silk comforter with the reverence of someone placing a priceless treasure, then stepped back to let Grace tuck her daughter in. "I'll be right next door, baby," Grace whispered, smoothing Sophie's curls. "You're safe now." When they were sure Sophie was deeply asleep, Vincenzo led Grace to a study down the hall. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked like they'd been collected over generations. A fireplace cast dancing shadows across the room, and Grace settled into a chair that probably cost more than her car. "Now talk," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "No more half-truths, no more mysterious answers. I want to know who you really are and why my daughter matters so much to you." Vincenzo poured himself a glass of whiskey from a crystal decanter but didn't drink. Instead, he walked to the fireplace and stared into the flames. "I told you I had a daughter once," he said finally. "Her name was Isabella. Bella. She had curls like Sophie's, and she laughed like sunshine, and she thought her daddy hung the moon." Grace waited, sensing there was more. "I also had a wife. Maria. We met when I was 25, just starting to work my way up in my father's organization. She was a teacher, completely innocent of this world. She knew what I did, but she thought love could change me." His voice grew softer. "Maybe it could have." He turned to face Grace, and she saw a pain in his eyes so deep it took her breath away. "Bella was 6 when it happened. A rival family decided to send me a message. They planted a bomb in Maria's car set to go off when she started the engine." Vincenzo's hands clenched into fists. "I was supposed to be driving that day. We'd planned to take Bella to the zoo. But I got called away on business, always business, and Maria took Bella alone." Grace's heart clenched. "Vincenzo. The bomb went off 3 blocks from our house. Maria died instantly. But Bella," his voice cracked. "She survived the initial blast. She was conscious when the paramedics found her, asking for her daddy. They rushed her to the hospital, and she called me on a nurse's phone." Vincenzo finally took a sip of his whiskey, but his hand shook slightly. "She was scared, asking me to come get her, saying she wanted to go home. I was 40 minutes away, stuck in traffic, helpless. I told her I was coming, that everything would be okay. But by the time I got there..." He stopped, unable to continue. Grace stood and moved closer to him. "She died calling for you. She died alone, asking why her daddy wasn't there to protect her." The words came out like broken glass. 7 years ago, and I still hear her voice asking for me. Still dream about what would have happened if I'd been there 5 minutes sooner." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Grace watched this man who commanded fear throughout Chicago break apart in front of her, and suddenly everything made sense. "When Sophie called you that night, I heard Bella's voice. The same terror, the same desperate hope that Daddy would come and make everything better." Vincenzo met her eyes. "This time, I wasn't going to be too late. Grace felt tears she'd been holding back all evening finally spill over. You saved us because we reminded you of them. I saved you because you needed saving. The fact that Sophie sounds like Bella, that she trusts me the way Bella used to. He set down his glass. That's just what made it matter more than it should have. I misjudged you, Grace said quietly. I thought you were just another criminal trying to buy his way into heaven. I didn't realize you were a father trying to save the children he couldn't save before. Don't make me into a hero, Grace. I've done terrible things. I'll probably do terrible things again. That's who I am. No, Grace said firmly. That's what you do. Who you are is the man who carries sick children to doctors, who reads bedtime stories, who risked his life tonight because a little girl needed him. A soft sound from the doorway made them both turn. Sophie stood there in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes with small fists. I had a bad dream, she whispered. And I couldn't find you. Both adults immediately went to her. Grace scooped Sophie up while Vincenzo knelt beside them. We're right here, baby, Grace murmured. You're safe. Can I sleep with you, Mommy? And can Mr. Vincent stay too? I don't want him to be alone. Grace looked at Vincenzo over Sophie's head. Something had shifted between them in the last hour. A wall had come down, a truth had been revealed. She saw him clearly now, not as the feared Mafia boss but as a broken man trying to protect what remained of his heart. Of course he can stay, Grace said softly. They settled on the enormous couch in front of the fireplace, Sophie curled between them like a bridge connecting two wounded souls. Grace stroked her daughter's hair while Vincenzo told quiet stories about the boats on the lake, his voice a gentle rumble that gradually lulled Sophie back to sleep. As the fire burned low and the night grew quiet, Grace found herself studying Vincenzo's profile in the flickering light. For the first time since that terrifying phone call had brought him into their lives, she wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid for him. Because she was starting to realize that somewhere along the way, without meaning to, she'd begun to care about the man who'd chosen to save them instead of himself. And in a world where caring about someone like Vincenzo Marino could get you killed, that was the most dangerous thing of all. But as Sophie sighed peacefully in her sleep and Vincenzo's hand found Grace's across their daughter's small form, Grace couldn't bring herself to regret it. Some risks were worth taking, even if they changed everything forever. 3 weeks later, Grace woke up in a bed that still felt too comfortable, in a room that still felt too big, to the sound of Sophie's laughter drifting through the French doors. She padded to the balcony and found her daughter in the garden below, chasing butterflies while Marco pretended to chase her, his intimidating frame looking ridiculous as he stomped around like a friendly giant. Careful, Uncle Marco! Sophie giggled. You're too slow, Uncle Marco. Grace shook her head with a smile. Somehow, Sophie had managed to adopt Vincenzo's entire crew as honorary family members. Tony was Uncle Tony, who taught her card tricks, and even the stern-faced guards had melted under her 7-year-old charm. Good morning, Vincenzo's voice came from behind her, warm and still slightly rough with sleep. Grace turned, taking in his appearance, hair mussed, wearing a simple t-shirt instead of his usual expensive suits. He looked younger somehow, more approachable. More like the man she'd come to know rather than the legend the city feared. Any word? She asked. Vincenzo nodded, his expression growing serious. It's done. The FBI raided Matteo's warehouses this morning. They found enough evidence to put him away for 3 lifetimes. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking. He won't be a threat to anyone ever again. Grace felt a weight lift from her shoulders. How did you manage that without getting my hands dirty? Vincenzo's smile was slight but genuine. I may be a criminal, Grace, but I'm not stupid. Sometimes the law is the most efficient weapon you can use. But how did they know where to look? Anonymous tips. Detailed financial records. Security footage from convenient locations. Vincenzo shrugged. Amazing what turns up when you know where to look for it. Grace studied his face. You've been planning this for weeks, haven't you? Since the night they attacked us. Since the night they touched what's mine. Vincenzo corrected, his voice carrying that familiar steel. Matteo chose the wrong way to start a war. Before Grace could respond, Sophie's voice rang out from below. Mommy! Mr. Vincent! Come see what Uncle Marco taught me! They went downstairs to find Sophie attempting to juggle 3 tennis balls with mixed success. She managed to catch 2 before the third bounced off her head, sending her into peals of laughter. Very impressive, Vincenzo said solemnly, applauding. I couldn't do that when I was your age. Really? Sophie's eyes widened. Were you not very coordinated? Terrible at it. Your Uncle Marco had to teach me everything. Marco grinned. Kid was all elbows and attitude when I met him. Took years to make him respectable. I'm still working on the respectable part, Vincenzo replied dryly, ruffling Sophie's curls. Later, as they sat around the kitchen table for lunch, Grace watched the easy interaction between Vincenzo and Sophie and felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't temporary anymore. Somewhere over the past few weeks, they'd stopped being house guests and started being family. Mr. Vincent, Sophie said suddenly, looking up from her grilled cheese sandwich. Can I ask you something important? Always, sweetheart. Sophie's expression grew serious, the way children's faces do when they're wrestling with big concepts. Mommy says we might stay here for a while. Like a long while. Would you like that? Vincenzo asked carefully. Yes, but... Sophie chewed her lip. If we stay, and you take care of us, and we take care of you, does that make us a family? Grace's breath caught. She looked at Vincenzo, whose expression had gone very still. What do you think? He asked Sophie gently. I think it does. I think you're like a second daddy. The kind who comes when you're scared and reads you stories and makes sure bad people can't hurt you. Sophie's voice grew smaller. Is that okay? Can I have a second daddy? The silence stretched for a heartbeat. Then Vincenzo reached across the table and took Sophie's small hand in his large one. I would be honored to be your second daddy, he said, his voice rough with emotion. If your mommy says it's okay. Both pairs of eyes turned to Grace, Sophie's bright with hope, Vincenzo's carefully guarded but yearning. Grace looked at this man who'd upended their lives, who'd brought danger and violence but also safety and love, who'd given them a home when they'd had nothing. I think, Grace said slowly, that families come in all shapes and sizes. And I think Sophie's right, we take care of each other. That's what families do. Sophie beamed and launched herself at Vincenzo, who caught her easily, holding her tight as she wrapped her arms around his neck. I love you, second daddy, she whispered. Grace saw the moment those words hit him, saw his eyes close, saw his shoulders shake slightly as he buried his face in Sophie's curls. I love you too, baby girl, he whispered back. More than you'll ever know. That evening, they shared their first official family dinner in the formal dining room. Grace had insisted on cooking spaghetti with marinara sauce, garlic bread, and a salad. Nothing fancy, but it felt right somehow. Normal. Sophie chattered about her day, about the books she was reading, about whether they could get a puppy. Vincenzo listened to every word like she was reciting poetry, while Grace found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. This is nice, Sophie declared, twirling pasta around her fork with more enthusiasm than skill. We should do this every night. We will, Vincenzo promised. As if summoned by the word family, Marco appeared in the doorway. Sorry to interrupt, boss, but the evening shift is in place. Perimeters secure. Grace glanced toward the windows, where she could just make out the shadows of Vincenzo's men taking their positions around the property. The reminder that they still needed protection should have been sobering, but somehow it wasn't. This was their world now, equal parts dangerous and beautiful, filled with armed guards and bedtime stories, business meetings and family dinners. It wasn't the life Grace had planned, but as she looked at Sophie giggling at something Vincenzo was saying, she realized it was exactly the life they needed. Thank you, Marco, Vincenzo said. We'll be fine. As the evening wound down and Sophie dozed against Vincenzo's shoulder, Grace felt a peace she'd never experienced before. They were safe. They were together. They were home. Outside, Chicago glittered in the darkness, and somewhere in the shadows, loyal soldiers stood ready to protect what mattered most. But inside, a little girl who'd once called the wrong number in her moment of greatest need had found exactly what she'd been looking for all along. A family. Complete and unbreakable. Ready for whatever came next.